one thing that I didn't tell you that I wanted to cover is that I don't think it matters what side of the aisle you're on. Everybody thinks that the country is falling apart. Mm-hmm. It's the first topic of discussion that gets brought up with everyone I talk to. Doesn't matter what their occupation is. It doesn't matter what side of the fence they're on. It's always what's happening to our country. And Green Berets have, I mean, you guys are the first in. You get in there, you develop a fighting force for the oppressed, and you're very familiar with how this stuff happens. So how would you deconstruct and demoralize a nation?
I think a lot of it has to do with, I think in the simplest terms, it's an identity crisis. Why do people fight for a nation? What does it even mean to be a part of a nation? It's generally you have a shared cultural, shared experiences, shared icons. You have all of those things which build some sort of connection to the past and then association with everybody else. So that even if you disagree on various things, there's still unifying components within your culture that you can both hearken back to and look on with a certain element of pride, but that also are important for developing traditions. There's an interesting quote. I think the person's name was Bell, and he gave a definition of culture, and he goes, "What is it?" He goes, "It's society's attempt to come up with a coherent set of answers to the existential questions we face throughout our lives." If you think about that it kind of works. Culture is it's not just skin color. It's not race. It's not, food or dress or it's kind of it can be all of those things. But it really comes down to fundamental questions that how does a group of people that have individual objectives for their life, different preferences and whatnot, but how do they live in society with one another where they can cooperate in order to achieve something? And at other times, leave each other alone when they disagree, but still feel a sense of unity, camaraderie, and connection. So how do you break that apart? Well, you have to challenge the overall narrative, both of the history, like how did you get to where you are today? Because if you take pride in it, well, then it's something worth preserving. And even if you think that there's a problem with it, you might want to fix those problems. So perfect example within U.S. history would be if you view U.S. history through the lens, the philosophy of the Declaration of Independence. We believe, we find these truths self-evident that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, you can look back and say, we didn't live up to that. Some people might even say we're still not totally living up to it the way that we should, which is maybe why in the preamble of the Constitution it says to create a more perfect union. It's because we recognize. But that sentiment is, I believe, true and noble, that you're endowed by your creator, that the rights that you have are not just preferences or gifts that the government gives you, that there's certain rights that are inherent about being a human being, that we are created equal, and that, again, we're endowed by our creator, unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, not the provision of it, the pursuit of happiness. That is a pretty strong, I believe, that's a pretty strong philosophy to build a culture around. But what if I come back later and I tell you that, yeah, that sounds really nice, but the guy that wrote it was just a slave owner? In fact, all these people that, were trying to set up liberty, they just wanted liberty for white men because women couldn't vote at the time. And you know what? They just really didn't want to pay their taxes. That's what this was really about. So what do you have? You have a white patriarchal society that was rooted in enslaving certain people based off of the color of their skin. And they set up this system because it would be beneficial for them financially. And all of your other ideas or notions about what a wonderful philosophical concept this was, that was marketing. That was marketing to help rich white guys get what they want at the expense of other people. That's all it was. Well, right at the get-go, I've completely undermined why you would want to fight for such a culture in the first place. So once I start undermining the cultural ties that bind, now let's admit a couple of things. We can look back and say there are elements of that statement that are true. But then all of a sudden, when we put it back in context and we recognize, well, wait a second, every society at the world at that time had some form of institution of slavery. Every single society at that time, had some of the bad things, the negative aspects of it that we just discussed. So what was different? Well, what was different was what they were actually rapidly expanding the concept of liberty and suggesting who it should apply to. I mean, to say in 1776, after thousands upon thousands of years of history that were rooted in, racially based discrimination, that were rooted in a political elite controlling everything, you now have somebody say, no, we're all created equal. And even if we're not living up to it, that is the standard. That's the truth. That was revolutionary. That's incredible. And it's easy to look back now, 200 plus years later, and say, well, of course that's the way it's supposed to be. It wasn't of course back then. They fought for that. They died for that. They might not have fully lived up to it, but they set us on the path to be able to achieve a level of individual liberty, prosperity, and security that is unheard of in world history. But if I erase all that, and I view it purely from this lens without any context, I can convince you, especially if you're a younger person, I can convince you that this is all bad, especially if you can still look around at society and find certain inequities, right?
Yeah.
There's certain disparities of outcome. Well, some disparities of outcome exist because of bad policy. Some disparities of outcome exist because you're lazy and that dude works hard. That's not an injustice.
Yeah.
It's not an injustice that the guy, working super hard in a high demand field makes more money than the person that isn't doing those things. But if I can convince you that it actually is injustice, well, what am I doing? I've taken away your shared history. I've taken away your shared connection with your neighbor. And now I'm supplanting that with a different narrative. And that narrative has to be rooted on who do I need to be fighting with the people in power. And that's where I can come up with the whole system of oppressed, oppressor. You're the person that the entire system is stacked against. I'm going to essentially galvanize your support, and I'm going to point you at an enemy, real or imagined. And I'm going to give you a new narrative, because I can't just say the old narrative is bad. I got to replace it with a new one. So I give you a new narrative, and I make that the narrative worth fighting for, because now your entire identity is caught up in that narrative. It's your entire identity is caught up in that movement, because I haven't left you with anything else, right? Because your nuclear family, that's a tool of the patriarchy, right? Your country, that's just racist, bigoted, and discriminating, right? Your very identity, well, I don't know, if you are a certain skin color or, you're heterosexual or whatever else, well, you're part of the oppressor class. How do I get you how do I move you from the oppressor class into an ally class or the oppressed, who are the good guys? We have to change the nature of your identity. What if it doesn't correspond with reality? What objective reality? Postmodernism tells us there is no objective reality. There is no objective truth. There is only lived experience. There's only oppressor and oppressed. And if you're an oppressor, you're a bad guy that needs to be taken down, and there's nothing you can do, right? It's as my friend Christian puts it, it's the original sin theory with no redemption. I do all of those things, and now I have a very powerful group of very disaffected people that have a philosophy rooted in nothing other than the movement.
Yeah.
And at that point, now it's just a run through the cultural institutions. It's everything Gramsci talked about in Italy in the 1930s. It's the idea of looking at the institutions which form culture. And we tend to look toward politics, but politics is downstream from culture. The real culturally shaping institutions are your school system, your academia, media, the arts and entertainment, Hollywood. They're the ones that are actually telling you the stories about who you are, what your country is, and everything else. And if they've all decided on a particular narrative, and that narrative is rooted like in the United States, largely in postmodernism, deconstructionism, critical theory, and now all of a sudden your feet are firmly planted in nothing, well, then that identity crisis provides me a huge opportunity to be able to destabilize what it is and replace it with what I want it to be.